Hey, welcome everybody. This is Ian, and joining me today we have Carson Gross. Carson is the creator of HTMX, which you may or may not have heard of, but by the end of this talk, you will know everything about it. So we're very lucky and fortunate to have Carson here with us to talk with us about HTMX. If you follow my channel for a while, you know I'm big on HTMX, and you may have seen some of my work chatting about it in the past. But here we're going to hear it from the horse's mouth. Carson, tell us a little bit about yourself and just HTMX in general.
Sure. My name is Carson Gross. I created HTMX. I teach. My main job is teaching at the university, or excuse me, Montana State University. So I teach computer science there. HTMX is something I've been working on in some form or the other for about a decade now. It started as a library called Intercooler.js, which was based on jQuery. It's a front end library. So if people haven't heard of it yet, it's a library used for building sort of more dynamic websites. It doesn't follow the sort of more typical front end approach of reactive programming where you write JavaScript expressions and there's some mechanism for updating HTML based on the JavaScript as the data. Instead, HTMX really focuses in on HTML and tries to make HTML more powerful as a hypermedia is the way that I would say it at this point. What do I want to say beyond that? I have a research group at Montana State around hypermedia that I'm just spinning up. I'm actually going to try and get a PhD. I've got a master's in CS, but I'm going to try and get a PhD. I think I've got a pretty good thesis, sort of based on HTMX. This is maybe a little academic, and hopefully the listeners will understand it by the end of the talk. But I say that what HTMX does is it generalizes something called hypermedia controls. So don't worry about what that means right now, but there's enough meat there intellectually that I got a paper recently accepted by the ACM Hypertext Conference around that idea. And so I think I'm going to try and turn that into a thesis and see if I can get a PhD out of the whole thing. Um, that's the big thing. I live in Montana, obviously, if I'm teaching at Montana State. The other big thing in my life right now is youth baseball, which I joke a bunch about on Twitter. If you're not familiar with my Twitter account, it's HTMX_org. And I'm pretty silly on Twitter. Have a lot of fun there. Yeah, I think those are the big things.
Very cool. Definitely want to hear more about the youth baseball at a later time.
Sure.
So, what was the inspiration behind HTMX? Was there a specific problem that you were trying to solve?
The original problem that created what became Intercooler.js, and Intercooler.js I created that back in 2013. That turned into HTMX in 2019, I think, when I did a rewrite. But what became Intercooler.js was basically a jQuery function. So this was back in the day when everyone was writing jQuery. So it was probably like 2010 or 11-ish, because I worked with this library that I hadn't named, and I didn't have open source experience or anything like that at the time. GitHub was just coming into existence. I was working on a project for a friend who he had a startup, and the startup had this kind of like table view, but it was like a nested table view where you could expand like sub components within it, sort of a pivot table like thing if you've ever worked with pivot tables. So it was a pretty complicated UI, and they just wanted the ability to click on like the top level columns and sort the data. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm a fancy JavaScript programmer and I know jQuery pretty well. And I've gone to graduate school. I know sorting algorithms and all the rest of it. And so I'll do that sort, the DOM sort, on the client side, because that'll obviously be very fast. And I worked on it for a couple of days, and I just couldn't make it go fast. It just was very, very slow. And this was back again in like 2011-ish, say. And so the run times for JavaScript at the time were very slow, so it just wasn't working. I couldn't make it work for more than like say 50 rows. So it just bogged down for very large data sets. And I just almost out of desperation was like, there's a function I think called get, or maybe I forget what it is, but there's a jQuery function that I found where you can just say like, get the value from this URL and then stick the result into like this DOM element. And I was like, I'd like just okay, nothing else is working. I'll just try doing the sorting on the server side instead of on the client side. And lo and behold, at the time, that was like it was like almost instant. And so, I was a big technical hero for the company because I made this thing work that like no one else was able to do. And it was using this really what I thought was pretty stupid technique of like just make all the HTML on the server side and then jam it into the DOM. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you were allowed to do that. That's kind of cool. And so I sort of built up this function to like help me do that a little bit in a little bit more structured way. That's not, it wasn't reactive at the time. The thing, and really at the time, the first major reactive framework that I saw that was open source. I was familiar with some older stuff that was sort of closed source, but the first open source reactive library that I saw was Angular. And that was like Angular 1. I forget, the Angular's been through a bunch of different versions, so I don't know all the subtleties of that. But it was the first version of Angular, and Google was pushing it pretty hard, and a lot of people were very excited about it. And I looked at it, and I didn't like a lot of it because I thought it was too complicated. But I did like that they used attributes in the HTML to drive the behavior. And I thought to myself, oh, that's kind of like href or like action in form tags. And so I took that idea and then mixed it with this function that I had that was like sort of just issuing it requests, getting HTML and putting it somewhere in the DOM. And I squished those things together and said, okay, I'm going to use attributes to basically drive these HTTP requests and like where to put stuff in the DOM when a response comes back in HTML form. And that became intercooler.js. And so it was in response really fundamentally to a performance issue that I couldn't get working at a reasonable level of performance in 2011 on the client side. These days, who knows if I would have stumbled into it because the JavaScript runtimes are very good in the browsers, and maybe it would have been good enough. So, and computers are obviously better and so forth. So, I don't know. I don't know if today I would have like stumbled on the same idea, but that's sort of how it all got started.
Yeah, definitely. What do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
I recall, so I got in the game a little bit later than you, obviously, but not so late that I wasn't experiencing jQuery. And I had taught a course on jQuery back in the day. And I remember when I was creating the course and I was like, okay, we're going to hit this endpoint, we're going to bring in this JSON. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
what? Why am I bringing in JSON? Why don't I just make the
Right.
template with whatever templating language on whatever backend and then
Right.
just plop it in? I'm like,
Yep.
well, this is the way I was told to do it. So,
Yeah, I think programmers like thinking in terms of functions. Like there's
Mhm.
something that it's that style of programming is what's known as RPC, remote procedure call. There's if you step back and you think about like what's the web and like as a distributed computing system, like what is it? It's very different than what programmers tend to like. We like functions, right? Like oh, I pass parameters like query parameters or maybe form encoded parameters in the body or something like that, whatever. Hopefully that's all abstracted away from you and you're not dealing with raw HTTP, but you're passing parameters and then you're getting data back. And we like that, as programmers because it's just very familiar to us. And the web really has this different architecture where it's hypermedia oriented, where you get back stuff that's, I'll call it a self-describing document. What I mean by that is that the HTML that you get back contains all of the operations. It's a mix. It's a violation actually of something called separation of concerns, which your listeners may have heard of, because it mixes together explicitly, and this is the design of the web. It explicitly mixes together presentation data as well as the network operations on the whatever that presentation data is representing. So, to make that concrete, like when you go to your bank and you log in and then you see your account balance and you say, I want to add funds or withdraw funds or whatever, you're clicking on buttons and all that stuff. If that's done in a traditional, like as a traditional web app where you're getting back HTML, the HTML that comes down tells the browser, hey, here's all the stuff you can do with this thing. And the browser doesn't know what that thing, it doesn't know what an account is or any of that stuff. It just knows how to render HTML. And so that data that it's getting back is just it's very special. It's very weird in some ways for programmers to think about conceptually, because we're so used to just here's the parameters, here's the data we get back, and then I do something with the data. And that's not the way hypermedia really is designed to work. It's designed with this different sort of mindset, a little bit more flexible, a little sloppier in some ways. Harder to reason about, like I think from a formal perspective, but it turns out to be very flexible and very, the success of the web, I think you have to say, like, it's been a very successful network architecture. So I don't know, maybe a little too nerdy for some listeners, but I think the reason for the persistence of JSON, the reason why so many people, when they look at HTMX, which uses HTML in the response formats, the reason why people react so strongly against it is because JSON just has this, like, it rhymes with the rest of the development that we do. With, like, oh, there's parameters, there's response data, I make a function call, I get back the data, and I do some stuff with it. And that's just not the hypermedia way. That's not the way hypermedia works.
Yep. Yeah, that's kind of my next question that you've already answered is like the fork in the road where we went from the early days of the web to what we have now, which is predominantly JavaScript library and framework dominated. Uh, but if we had gone back to that kind of pivotal moment where it's like all of a sudden we started to decide to use JavaScript for everything versus
Yeah.
augmenting what we already had with HTML, which is kind of what you've done with HTMX.
Yeah.
And it sounds like part of the reason that happened is just because of, as programmers, we're like, well, this makes sense to us, so this is the
Right.
direction that we're going to go in.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. I think also there was a failure of thought leaders to communicate. Well, so a big part of it too is a lot of thought leaders thought that hypermedia, the ideas of hypermedia like REST and Helios and all that stuff, was going to jump from HTML and the web onto, like, the API, into the API world
Hmm.
successfully. They thought, like, okay, hypermedia has worked so well for the web with just links and forms and, like, standard web 1.0 style stuff. And, like, look at the web, it's growing exponentially. This must be a good enough idea that it works well for APIs. And so, like, if you've ever heard of the Richardson maturity model, I think the RMM, which was a model for thinking about how mature APIs were. And when I say API here, what I mean is, like, data APIs, APIs that are presenting data. Um, that was something put out by ThoughtWorks, and oh, I forget the guy's name, the ThoughtWorks guy, but they put out this idea, and they were really, at the time, they were focused on XML because JSON hadn't sort of taken over completely yet. But they're really, I think most of the thought leaders thought that REST and Helios was going to make the jump into data APIs, and it never really did successfully. There have been many valiant efforts to do so, but it's just never really taken off on the API, sort of on the data API side. And so that's why today, unfortunately we use the term REST. When someone says REST, they mean JSON API over
Yeah.
HTTP pretty much. But that's technically incorrect. I don't, that's a lost battle at this point. There is an essay, if you're interested, on the HTMX website called "How Did REST Come to Mean the Opposite of REST?" On, if you go to htmx.org/essays, you can find that, and that's, like, sort of goes through the history of this. So yes, programmers are used to thinking in sort of functional terms, like pass parameters to get data back. Also, I think the thought leaders kind of went down this, like, rabbit hole of, like, trying to make hypermedia concepts work with data APIs that never really worked out that well. Siren is an example of trying to do that. And I think there was a good effort, like very smart people working on it, but it just never took off the way the web did. And then, things like GraphQL, which are very much not hypermedia at all, have ended up sort of dominating the data APIs. And then a third thing that I would point out to you that I think really led to the fact that hypermedia didn't compete against the sort of JSON juggernaut was, I guess, sort of two things that are related to one another. First, HTML sort of froze as a hypermedia. Like, they didn't make it any better as a hypermedia. They added, like, client side stuff and new APIs for like Canvas and like all this sort of like very client side oriented, but they didn't do much in terms of hypermedia. And in fact, they took stuff away. Like frame sets used to be a thing you could use, and then they deprecated them, took them away. And so, like these ideas like that were around for a long time, such as transclusion, which is the idea of taking a document and putting it somewhere in the screen instead of replacing the whole screen, just all kind of like faded into the background. And that I think was coupled with what I saw, and maybe I'm just seeing what I wanted to see, but I saw a lot of intellectual intimidation as well. Like
Hmm.
people, if they were doing things the old way, or if they were doing things like, like what I saw when people would respond to intercooler JS and so forth and you see it today, even, with HTMX, people online, they'll be like, this is the old way of doing things. This is stupid. Like, this is just dumb. This is the way we used to do it. Like, and that's not an argument, but it's
Yeah.
like, well, okay, you have to engage the conceptual ideas. Like, we've had bad ideas. Like we had, we had leisure suits for a while. That was a bad idea, and we decided to walk away from that. So, but I think that's in our industry, in the computer industry. There's there's this latent fear of becoming obsolete. And today, for example, right? Like COBOL, someone who learns COBOL today, right? Like that's great, and they'll probably make a ton of money being a COBOL programmer. But there was, like these COBOL dinosaurs, whatever. They're laughing to the bank, and that's one thing. But then the other thing is always in my mind is like, what about the Perl developers? Because like Perl developers in like 1998 were like, they were wizards. And they had all sorts of options, and were just on top of the world. And then the Java juggernaut came in and really like blew up, in my opinion, like that whole ecosystem. And if you were a Perl developer, things got very hard. It could get very hard for you. So there's a latent fear, I think, that all developers have, like, oh, I'm becoming obsolete, I'm becoming a dinosaur. We're in a very forward-looking industry, and so I think there was a little bit of intimidation too. I know I felt it when I was trying to advocate for intercooler JS, because people would just be like, oh, this is stupid, this is the old way of doing things, and I have gotten better at ignoring that feedback, but when I was younger, it was like, man, maybe they're right. I mean, if you go and look at like the pinned post on the Twitter account, it's like, maybe I'm out of touch. No, it's the rest of the internet that is wrong. And like, you kind of have to have that attitude a little bit to take a hard look, I think, even today, to take a hard look at something like HTMX, just because the standard way of building things is with JSON and React or some React-like framework.
Definitely. I think the biggest problem that I've come across with these different frameworks like React is that it's de facto. People are just like, "Oh, we have a project, reach for
De
React." And I'm like,
facto.
"Does it even like merit using that library? Like, what are the reasons? It's a super simple project. Do you really want to
Yeah.
like have to go get something like Create React App or V and like spin up this whole thing just so you can have like this little thing over here?"
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's
Y-
not to say that it doesn't make sense for some projects, but
Yeah. Yeah,
certainly,
I totally agree. I think it's funny that, have you ever seen that interview with a senior JS developer thing on
which
YouTube?
one
It's the
is it?
one, the guy who's got a fake beard on, and he's like, I think he's Norwegian or Nordic or maybe Danish or something like that. It's really funny. And he keeps saying like de facto. He keeps saying it over and over again, and it is true. You hear it so much. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I guess I don't know. And I think there are definitely times when HTMX and the hypermedia approach isn't appropriate. There's times when these other libraries are appropriate. We can argue. My typical experience online is that people are like, "Oh, HTMX is good for a toy website," and I'm like, "That is not true. HTMX is good for much more than a toy website. It's not good for certain classes of websites, though." And I'm happy to have that conversation. Like if you've got a rich text editor, like you can't be building that with HTMX. It could integrate with a broader HTMX application. And the way I would typically recommend people to do that is with events. But there are types of applications that aren't going to be built easily with HTMX. And so, I try to be pretty forthright about that. But I think a lot of people, particularly people that have invested a lot in the current infrastructure around JavaScript, like they just don't want it to be, it can't be that easy, right? Like it can't be that easy. It's like, well, it can be for some stuff,
Yeah.
and it's not an either or either. That's another, developers are prone to being very either or and not, like, okay, this is just like another tool. It doesn't threaten your identity. It's all good. Like you're still a good person and you're still
Yeah.
a good developer. And, those tools that you already know are probably good for a lot of stuff. And this is probably good for some other stuff. So,
Yeah.
but I think we're breaking through. I think like it's been around enough and there's enough excitement around it that, I see people certainly on Twitter that a year or two ago that were like kind of in my replies being mean now are like begrudgingly respectful, and feel like, like, okay, it's usable for some stuff. So, and,
Yeah.
we'll argue about what the set of all things that HTMX is appropriate for, but I think it's making headway.
So you said about a decade ago, Intercooler JS. Before that, it was not named anything, just kind of
Yeah.
came as part of a project you were doing, and then
Yep.
segued into what it is now. And you've even released your second version here recently.
Yep.
Um, where do you think like the catalyst was that where you really started seeing things take off, and you thought like, oh, finally?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was last year, July. It was last year in July, and I've said this before, but I'm involved in youth baseball here, and I was at the state tournament for Bozeman baseball, or it was in Bozeman. It was a state tournament for I think I forget which age groups, and I was there not because I wanted to be there or because my kids were playing there, but because of like youth baseball drama. So I was like called in as like a third party to like, it was crazy. And so I'm sitting there like all day, like, a bunch of games that I don't care about. But I'm sitting on a bucket in like the shed, and I look at my phone and I'm like, what is going on? Like, and it turned out that the Primogen and the Fireship dev, like within 72 hours of one another, both released. I think it was Primogen first, and then it might have been like a week later that Fireship dev did it. I'll have to go back and check the timeline. And so the way I remember it anyways, it was Primogen started talking about HTMX. And at first he was like, I don't want to say he wasn't skeptical, but he wasn't like a fanboy. Like, now I'd say he's pretty positive on HTMX. He and I have a very good relationship and he's a great guy and a big supporter. But at the time he was just finding out about it and was like still going through all the whatabouts, like, what about this? What about that? Blah, blah, blah. But he's just got such tremendous reach that even him like being like moderately interested in it was like just my phone, like my follower count on Twitter, the GitHub stars, just like everything went straight up for pretty much a month. And I got lucky that I released a book. Hold on, do I have it? I don't have it on me. I released a book at the same time, and called Hypermedia Systems. So if your listeners want to check that book out, it's available online for free at hypermedia.systems. You can read it online. You can also you can buy a Kindle version. There's a hardcover version, and then there's an EPUB version. And I have uploaded the EPUB version to LibGen. So if you don't want to pay for it, if you want the EPUB version, you can go and get it from LibGen. And tomorrow we're releasing a paperback. Sorry, a little bit salesy, but tomorrow we're
No,
releasing a
no worries.
paperback.
I'll put all these links in the description, and I'm sure by the
Yeah,
time the video is edited and published, you'll have
yeah,
the link for the paperback. So awesome.
yeah. So actually, tomorrow is July 17th, which is the 1 year anniversary of the book release. So,
Oh heck yeah.
and we're gonna release the paperback on the 1 year anniversary. So, in any event, all that stuff kind of like came together at once, and just it went absolutely vertical for like a month, like to the point that I was a little bit scared because I got a lot more attention, and I'm pretty silly on Twitter, and I'm not
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
like I've got a job at university and all that stuff. So I'm like, I don't know how many people I want looking at me, but it's gone really well. And another thing that came up at that same point was like a lot of people, it was right around when Elon Musk bought Twitter. And so a lot of big names on Twitter quit. And so there was a big turnover in like tech Twitter that allowed, I think, the HTMX Twitter account to like really become like sort of like more important in that world. And so just talk about like dumb luck,
Oh man,
like
yeah, perfect timing on all
absolutely
counts.
just dumb. What is it? God has a special providence for orphans, drunks in the United States of America, and apparently HTMX. So
Oh, that's great.
I don't know what to say about it.
So, what during the? I mean, it sounds like it's been developed over a long time span. But are there any like
Yeah.
specific points during its development where you really felt like there were some critical bottlenecks, some technical challenges that you had to get over, or has it been pretty smooth sailing?
I feel like the idea of HTML, if you go back and you look at the first check-in of Intercooler, the basic ideas are there of like, okay, let's just for your listeners, what is HTMX? Like what do you actually do with it? So what you do is you put attributes on elements in your HTML. So if you have a button, for example, and you want that button to issue a put or a delete, to a given URL, then what you do is on that button, you say hx-delete equals, and then you give it the URL just like you would in an href to issue a delete request to. And then you can say via some more attributes like hx swap and hx target, you can say, I want you to take the resulting HTML and I want you to target this element. And then here's how I want you to replace it. Like with HX swap, you might say replace the whole element, or you might say put the response content inside the element or at the end of the element or right after the element. Like there's all these different options. And so there's like, a core 10, maybe 12 attributes that let you add these behaviors to elements on the screen and then like, basically drive things like drive the behavior of issuing the response, like what's the event that triggers the actual request, and then where do you issue the request to, what type of request is it, and then where do you place it in the DOM and how do you place it in the DOM. Those sort of 5 things are what HTMX gives you control over. And those core ideas, I think, were in like the first check-in. And so there's been a lot of like me learning how or like modern JavaScript works in as much as the code base is modern, which is not. But just figuring stuff out and like, okay, like how do we properly gather form inputs and make sure it behaves the same way that actual forms behave. So there's been a lot of polish, but really I think the core ideas were there back in 2013. I don't think it's been a technical challenge. I think the challenge has been just getting people to recognize the validity of the approach, and then just grinding on making like little things better and better. So HTMX 2.0, which we released this summer, is not, from an API perspective, is nearly identical to HTMX 1. We dropped IE support so we could clean up some internals in the code, and then we changed a few defaults like around security related stuff. And there was one major API change. If you're creating plugins for HTMX, there was a major API change. But like most users of HTMX wouldn't notice the difference between HTMX1 and HTMX2. And that's kind of intentional. Like, I don't know. I just feel like if you get the conceptual idea correct, and I think HTMX for what it is, like you can argue about whether or not that conceptual idea is a good one for your particular problem. But once you get that idea pretty much correct, then it's just a matter of like, okay, like there's stuff around the edges, stuff we need to sand down, integrating it well with other technologies like web components are always sort of a thorn in my side because they're difficult to work with. New APIs like there's the new transition API that came out from Chrome, and there's a lot of really neat stuff like that coming out from them. There's an API that I'm actually advocating for, which lets you do reparenting of DOM elements without losing state, so without losing the
Oh wow.
focus, or like video state, like being able to move a video element from one place on the screen to another and have the video continue playing.
Oh nice.
That would be amazing to have for not just for HTMX, but for everybody. Like, even like React and like all these other, like just being able to completely rejigger the DOM and have your stuff keep working, would really open up a lot of possibilities, I think, for web development. And so that's an API that I've been sort of advocating to the Chrome team for, and they've actually implemented it in their Canary browser. So hopefully there will be enough interest in that we'll get something like that. And if that comes along, then I'll integrate that into HTMX. But I don't expect big changes to it,
Mhm.
going forward. So
You mentioned earlier, HTML hasn't really changed in a long time, other than like the addition of some things like Canvas.
yeah.
What are the? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say it's changed a lot. Like HTML5 had a lot in it. It's just none of it. It didn't change like the fundamental hypermedia
Hmm.
like abilities of HTML is what has not changed. Like they've added a ton of junk. It's just like they keep not adding any hypermedia stuff. So
So that brings me to my next question: is like, what are the odds that something like HTMX or even HTMX gets added into the HTML spec as like an
I don't
official?
Yeah, so there's a guy named Alex Petros. Petros, I'm gonna butcher his last name. I think it's Petros. And he gave a talk at Big Sky DevCon, which was the conference we just had here in Bozeman. And he talked about, okay, what like realistically what from HTMX could be integrated into HTML without causing like a huge disruption. And there's a lot of decisions in HTMX that I think aren't appropriate for, being integrated into HTML. So like, for example, the way that the swapping works, there's some kind of janky stuff in there to make CSS transitions work properly that I would have a hard time recommending that that's pretty specialized. And like the event model, like all the events we trigger, like it doesn't feel appropriate to me. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's a lot. So he has kind of boiled that down to a few small, like very small changes that could be made to HTML that would give it, sort of an 80-20 version of HTMX. And so the three proposals, let me see if I can remember them, are first allowing forms to issue puts, patches, and deletes. So that's one thing that's like obvious, like everyone recognizes that should be the case.
Hmm.
Um, Allow buttons to specify an href, like basically allow buttons to be their own control, so they don't have to be in a form. Or if they are in a form, they can do something else, not just submit that form. Because a common pattern on the web, for example, is you got some edit UI, and you've got a cancel button, and then or a save button, and then a cancel button. You want that cancel button to do something different. You don't want it to submit the form, right? And you can't have forms nested inside of forms, and so like it's just unfortunate the buttons
Yeah,
can't
the
be
all the
hypermedia
selecting
controls.
and the preventing of default and all the extra
Yeah,
JavaScript
just
stuff that should just be baked right
yeah,
in.
exactly. So if buttons could just do their own thing, that would solve a lot of those problems. And then the third thing is there's actually, and your listeners might be interested to learn this, believe it or not, with both forms and anchors, there is an attribute called target, which lets you specify a target to take the response and put it into. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but that attribute exists. Unfortunately, that target can only today be an iframe. That's the only, so you have to have an iframe, and then you can have an anchor somewhere else on the page and say, okay, go get this URL. And then using the target attribute, you can specify the ID of an iframe, and it'll take that HTML and put it into that iframe. And that's the technical term for that is what's called transclusion. And so that's one of the things that HTMX makes more general in HTML. So HTML has transclusion, but it's very constrained to use only iframes. You can also target like a new window. Like developers may have like used target like what is an underscore top or something like that, or
Underscore blank or
blank or whatever
yeah.
it is, right? So you have that ability to just target sort of random things, like kind of an underdeveloped feature, but whatever, it's there. And so the third part of his proposal is make it so you can specify a CSS selector in that target, and then just replace chunks of the screen, with responses for forms and buttons and anchor tags. And if you do that, now you're cooking with gas. Like I think that's a good 80-20. It's a very it builds on existing concepts. You're not introducing new attributes. Like you might be extending existing attributes to other elements, but you're not like, it's not like HTMX where it's just a whole new slew of things. And so he's really working hard on that proposal. He's going to get it. He's going to push it for the working group on for HTML as like a formal proposal, and he actually is working on a polyfill for it, so people can, use his and it's a very small library compared to HTMX, so people can use that to sort of explore how much. Okay, this is an 80-20 implementation of this idea. What can we, how much can we achieve with it? I think the answer is going to be quite a bit. So.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, the things you mentioned are just, those are the types of features that if you're, whether you've been in web development for a while or you're just coming in, you just expect like, oh, it should do that, right? And then you
Right.
find out, no, it doesn't do that. Like when I'm teaching students, we teach them, this is a form and it sends a GET request and you can make it send a POST request. And they're like, yeah, but what about those other methods you taught us on the back end? And I'm like, well, about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. I don't know what to tell you. I think there's people are it's a big ship, the HTML has been kind of a disaster, right? Because the W3C was running it for a while, and then the W3C has, sort of suffered, as far as I can tell, has suffered sort of bureaucratic death, and no longer contributes very much. And then the WATWIG, the working group, whatever that is,
Hmm.
sort of took over. And now HTML is what's called a living spec, which is a little unfortunate because I liked it back in the day when like new versions like HTMX or HTML6 or 7, like, and here are the features we expect for it. Like I kind of like
Yeah.
that, versus this sort of piecemeal rollout that they do now. I understand the dynamic of it, and I get it, but it was kind of exciting when there was like an actual like stamped release with a number. Um,
Yep.
so they took over, and I just think hypermedia, for better or for worse, like didn't have a good advocate and didn't have a good, hopefully HTMX is part of that. Is like, if nothing else, it's just a demo of like what hypermedia and HTML could be if they kept going with hypermedia ideas. And so, Alex is doing a good job, I think, of taking that on from a practical perspective. It's also a big organizational problem. Like just pushing through proposals like this require a tremendous amount of willpower and ability to like be in meetings and write documents and stuff like that. And so I think he's the guy to do that. I'm not the guy to do that. I'm good at memes, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
about.
The HTMX meme game is pretty strong. Uh,
Yeah.
that's the great thing about open source, though, right? You have people that are like, hey, this is my thing, and I'm willing to
Mm-hmm.
take on and collaborate and contribute in
Yep.
this certain area. So that's great
Yep.
that it works out that way.
Yeah, I've
Uh,
been very lucky to find some really good folks to work on HTMX with me. So, open source, it is what it is. Like, there's a lot of horror stories around it, and I don't know, what the answers are for like funding and like, when you get these big blowups. But I've been very happy with HTMX, the open source community. So.
heck yeah. What's your favorite feature of HTMX?
Favorite feature of HTMX is transclusion, the ability to take a response and put it anywhere on the screen. I think that's the big one, because like the triggering event, fine, whatever. You can use JavaScript to trigger a request if you need to. The URL to send it to, including put and patch and delete, like those are all obvious, like pretty simple things. But transclusion has a long history in the hypermedia literature, and just no one ever did it. Like even worse, they partially did it. They did it with iframes, and then they told
Hmm.
everyone not to use iframes. It's like, well, okay.
iframes on everything when I first started writing code.
Yeah, and right. And it's like, oh, this is horrible. It's totally inflexible. And it's like, well, okay, like there's another real obvious option here, which is like, what if we just let you like put the response anywhere on the screen instead of like just having iframes? There's history, like, people say, what about history? And I get it, but we can figure it out. So I'd say that's my favorite feature of HTMX. The second one that I like a whole bunch, and again, I don't think is appropriate for the HTML spec, is the event model. that HTMX has. Like I really tried hard to put a lot of useful events in that let you like catch things and like, like hold a request and then that event, like you can like basically delay a request and then issue it later on, and that integrates well with like the queuing model, because we queue up requests. If someone clicks 3 times, we don't issue 3 requests immediately unless you tell us to, which
Hmm.
I don't know why you would do that, but and so there's a request queue, and you can specify the behavior of that, and like those events and all that functionality all play really well together. So I was very happy with how the event model worked out in HTMX. I think it gives you, because HTMX itself is typically very declarative, which is great until you need to do something that the declarative model can't handle, and then you're screwed unless you have sort of hooks and callbacks and so forth. And so to me, the event model for HTMX are those callbacks. And I don't want to, I mean, I'm sure I've made bad decisions in parts of it, but I think it's a pretty good event model that gives you a fair amount of control if you want to get down into the mock.
I like that the implementing debalance is literally just delay and then however many
Yeah,
milliseconds.
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, for sure.
Awesome. So I'm not sure if you mentioned it already, or you did when you're talking about the essays, but for everyone watching, if you want to learn more about HTMX, htmx.org. Uh, Community-wise, there's a Discord. Are there any other places other than like I think you mentioned your Twitter handle earlier?
Yeah. So yeah, the Discord, you can go to htmx.org/discord, and that'll bounce you to the server. Um, there is a Reddit community, which I am technically the mod of, but I don't ever mod it. And so I think like every once in a while, like I'll remove some like absolutely ridiculous flame
Yeah.
situation. But I log in like maybe once a week to just make sure no one has posted like gore pics or something like that. But there are a lot of people there, and so if you're a Reddit person, then that's the place to go. I'm mostly on Twitter and then the Discord, and that's about it for me. Yeah, but Twitter, HTMX_org on Twitter is probably the best place to see like the silly content, anyways.
Cool. Yep. So for anyone watching, we'll have all those links that we mentioned and then the other resources from earlier in the chat. Before we close out here, what is your favorite pastime activity?
My
Non-coding
favorite.
related.
Well, I guess I gotta say youth baseball. I love kids playing baseball. My youngest son just finished his last year of 9-10 baseball, which is like one of my favorite years because they finally start figuring the game out. And now he's like up onto like a bigger field, and it's cool too. I like it's more like real baseball and so forth. But so I really enjoy coaching kids in baseball quite a bit, and playing, just playing catch with my kids and so forth. Um, so I'd say that's probably number one. Skiing is a close second. There's a lot of good skiing up here in Montana. I grew up skiing. My family is kind of weird. We all ski together. Like we don't, a lot of people like send their kids to go ski by themselves, but we all like skiing together as a family, and we're all close enough in ability that we can have a lot of fun. So those are probably the two things that are that I like the most. I fish a little bit when I can. It's hard with baseball, taking up so much time until you get into the summertime. So that's probably my top three.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the
Yeah.
time to jump on the call with me and chat about
Yep.
HTMX. Hopefully we'll see you again in the future. But
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian.